got a little... Oh, hi. Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be making a tiered shirred maxi skirt. I hope you enjoy. So in today's video, I'm going to show you how to make this tiered shirred skirt. They're really popular at the moment and I've started to become a skirt dress person, partially because of the heat we've been getting in the UK, but also now I realise how comfortable they are and I just want to wear them more. So I was out and about in town one day and then I saw someone wearing this type of skirt and I was like, oh, that's really cute. So I wondered what it would look like on me. So I managed to try one on and I fell in love. I really don't like making stuff or find it difficult to start making stuff I've never seen myself wear, because I don't want to make something and then it doesn't suit me or I get the fit wrong, if you get what I mean. So a lot of the time I stick to things that I know will work. But anyways, I feel like this is foolproof. I'm talking about it like it's overcomplicated, but I promise you it's not. It's just tedious. So to start the process, I took my measurements, I took my waist and my high hips and I added about 11.5 to 13.5 inches, which is 30 centimeters to 35 centimeters. So I added that onto the waist and to the hip measurement to accommodate for the shirring. I ended up adding a little bit more than usual because I didn't want it to stretch so much that you lose that shirring effect. Then I also decided how long I wanted the piece to be, which I determined by my hips. I wanted the band to stop kind of on my high hip line. So I marked my waist measurement at the top, measured 30 centimeters down and marked the hip measurement. Then I decided how many and how long I wanted my tiers to be. I decided on two, the first one being longer and the bottom being slightly shorter, and these were my measurements. This part of the pattern making is completely up to your design. Like, you can make multiple tiers, but I just thought less is more because with the colour I'm using, which my friend loves to call NHS blue, but I love it, it's just so vibrant. Anyways, I believe the fabric is like a cotton polyester blend. I'm not exactly sure, but it's not too heavy and not too thin, which is perfect for this project because it will shirt and gather really nicely. So I cut all my pieces out and also a lining piece, which was just one big rectangle, just a bit shorter than both tiers put together and as wide as the first tier, but later on in the video I say maybe you should make it just a little bit smaller than your first tier, but you'll see why. So the first thing to do is hem the top of the waistband and the bottom of the lining and of the bottom tier. To do this, I used a rolled hem foot, which makes life so much easier. It definitely takes practice, but the results are immaculate. I used a 0.6 centimeter allowance foot for mine. Some tips I have for doing this is to roll the fabric up at the start slightly and try and curve it into the loop of the foot. Do a few stitches and then the fabric should start to naturally coil. Also, hold the fabric taut from the front and the back when sewing to prevent any puckering. Next, I just gave all the hems an iron so that they're nice and crisp, and also you can see how good the rolled hem came out. I strongly advise getting one. I forgot to mention the thread I'm using, which is just a clear thread. I think it's nylon, I'm not 100% sure, but this was only because I didn't have a blue thread to match my fabric, so I thought clear is probably the best option. But I also thought it might give some stability to the waistband when I'm shirring it, which would be nice, but to be honest, it came out a lot softer than I expected. So to do the shirring, you want to load up your bobbin with the elastic thread, and when you're doing shirring you have to wind it by hand. You can't use the machine to wind it because it will stretch the elastic too much, so you have to wind it by hand. And then for the top thread you just use your normal thread. So you thread the machine as normal. So if you're using a manual machine, you want to change the length of your stitch to the longest possible. Make sure it's a straight stitch, by the way. And the tension, you need it to be the highest tension you have. My machine's computerized, so it automatically adjusts. I just had to change the length of my stitch. Anyways, back to the sewing. So once I finished hemming, it was time to move on to the time-consuming part, which is the shirring. Such a beautiful feature, but the most tedious to do, so I suggest putting some music on or a TV show on in the background. So before we start shirring the real thing, you always want to test it out on some scrap fabric beforehand. So I took a piece of the fabric I'm using and tested out my machine settings. I did roughly 5 rows of shirring and then evaluated if I was satisfied with the results, which I was, so I was ready to move on to the real thing. So the main part of this video will be me showing you how to do the shirring. Personally, I like to get my first shirring stitch quite close to the top of the hem. So I do one straight stitch and then I kind of do like a pivot stitch, but I do sort of move the needle a bit. So once I get to the end of my stitch, I keep my needle in the fabric, lift up my presser foot and swing the fabric around to the opposite side. Then I put it back down and make sure that I line up the edge of my presser foot with the last stitch that I made, and then I start sewing again, and then I keep repeating that, alternating sides all the way down the fabric. And during all this, your bobbin will run out, so I recommend doing at least 2 or 3 bobbins if you can. Another thing I want to mention when you're shirring is that when your bobbin runs out and you're left with like an awkward stitch in the middle just hanging there, make sure that you stitch quite a little bit back on that stitch just to make sure that it doesn't come out, because that would be so embarrassing if you put it on and then the stitch just pops in the middle. But yes, once you've got the hang of that, you just keep going until you reach the bottom of your fabric. So once you finish the shirring, we can close off the waistband. So I just folded the fabric in half, right sides facing each other, and I used pins to hold the edge together. Change your bobbin thread to a cotton thread and sew a straight stitch. Don't forget to back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and also change the length of your stitch back to a normal length. Next, just overlock the edge and we can move on to attaching our tiers. Once I finish my stitch, I also like to tie my threads by hand for extra security. I forgot to mention, I also tack the seam allowance to one side using a small zigzag stitch just so that it's not flapping about. Once you've sewn the waistband side seam, we can do the same to the 2 tiers and lining. So just fold your pieces, right sides facing each other, do a straight stitch and overlock it as well. Now let's start putting the pieces together. So I worked my way up from the bottom for this bit, and I gathered the top of my bottom tier until it matched the bottom of the middle tier. Together I like to make 2 straight stitches all the way around without back stitching and with the longest length stitch. Once you've done that, either pull on the top or bottom thread to gather your fabric. When you're doing this, try and keep your gathers even so that it flows nicely around the skirt instead of having full gathers on the front and then the back is flat. Once you're happy with your arrangement, pin the bottom tier to the middle tier, right sides facing, and sew with a straight stitch. Don't forget to back stitch and change your length back to its normal length. Once you've sealed your gathering, snip the excess threads and turn your project right sides out and carefully remove the visible gathering stitches we made earlier. Now we can attach the middle tier to the waistband. To do this, I quartered my fabric to make sure the gathers would be evenly distributed. I used the seam as my guide, so I folded it in half, marked it with a pin, and then matched the pin and the seam up to get the opposite sides. And do the same to both pieces, so the middle tier and the waistband. Next, match the seam with the seam, right sides facing, and then pin with the pins, stretch and pin all around. You may or may not need to gather it slightly to get it to fit. Mine was slightly too big, but I was in a rush because I wanted to wear it that same day, so I added some small pleats instead. So once you're done pinning, we need to sew it up with a straight stitch, and don't forget to back stitch. Keep in mind for this bit that it's important that we stretch the waistband to match the middle tier. Otherwise, if we gather the tier into the waistband in its shirred state, we won't be able to climb in and out because it's not stretching with the waistband, if that makes sense. Also, I quickly want to mention this quartering method that I used to attach this bit, you could also do for the last tier as well. The skirt is basically assembled now, so all you have to do is overlock the seams we just created at the tiers. But I wanted to line the skirt, so I took my lining piece and repeated the last step again, but I pinned the lining right sides facing the seam allowance so that we hide the inside seams. I'm glad I did this because it added more volume to the length of the skirt, but I wish I would have made my lining width just a bit smaller than the middle tier because I found that it puffed out at the seam a bit too harshly because of that double layer. Nevertheless, it still looked good and I was happy with everything. And basically that was it. I put on a skirt and skedaddled. Here's the final reveal.